Good afternoon everybody, and formally welcome to this important forum to discuss refugee and asylum seeker issues as they pertain to the lead up to the Wentworth by-election, which I'm sure all of you know is next Saturday. Certainly these four people know it's next Saturday. My name's Phil Glendenning. I'm the President of the Refugee Council of Australia, and it's a couple of introductory remarks to say that the forum has been organised by a coalition of local refugee rights organisations, faith-based and citizens groups here in this electorate, and coming under the banner of Wentworth for Refugees. And I'd like to thank Wentworth for Refugees for putting the forum on this afternoon. Thank you very much. But we gather on Aboriginal land, always was, always will be, and I'd like to acknowledge the Bidjigal and Gadigal people who are the traditional owners of the country that we're on. And I pay my respect to elders past and present, and to any of our First Nations peoples who are here today. We gather here in peace. We'd also like to acknowledge those people here who have a real lived experience of refugee and seeking asylum. We are with you, and the fact that this event is taking place and the candidates here take it seriously. And I'd like now to introduce the four that we have. To my left, we have Licia Heath, who's an independent running next week. We have Dominic WY Kanak, who is representing the Greens. We have Dr. Kerryn Phelps, who is an independent. And we have Andrea Leong from the Science Party. We also have in the audience Barry Caldulis from the Arts Party. Put your hand up, Barry, who is passionate about this issue and may have something to say a little bit later. Would you please welcome our candidates this afternoon? Okay, so our process this afternoon is, in arranging this forum, we have asked invitations to 7 candidates in the by-election. We have the 4 seated here today. We have Barry sitting in the audience, and we also invited the Liberal candidate Dave Sharma, the Labor candidate Tim Murray, and the Small Business Party candidate Angela Vitukas. And we have to say we are all disappointed that these 3 candidates chose not to attend. And we have some empty chairs here to represent the fact that they're very welcome, but weren't able to make it. So today we're going to hear from each of the candidates for 5 minutes about their vision and values on refugee and asylum policy. And following that, we're going to hear a little bit more about 2 of the key issues that Wentworth refugees have identified, particularly the recent cuts to the Status Resolution Support Service process, which I think most of you would be aware of, which is the income support and counselling provided to people waiting for their refugee application to be determined. That has been officially withdrawn, rendering some 7,000 people at risk of homelessness. Secondly, obviously, the recent push to get children off Nauru, a sense of what's happening there. And from where I sit, I think there's a bit of movement in that area, and certainly I know that it's an issue that's fundamentally important for people in this electorate, particularly given the call from the AMA for their immediate evacuation. And following all of that, we're going to have 30 minutes for Q&A with the candidates. And I have to say that one of our candidates, Kerryn's got to leave a little bit early, not because she needs to leave this discussion, but because there's another appointment you have to get to. And with a week to go before a by-election, we can understand that. So, in terms of the process of the way forward, I'm sure we're all here because we're concerned. We've got a few little ground rules we're going to just explain to keep the discussion going well. So obviously we're going to treat everybody with respect, even if you find yourself disagreeing strongly. We're asking that there be no heckling or interrupting of speakers. It's not a protest event. And we'll have time limits to those 5 minutes. I've got a very able person down here somewhere who's going to be timing everything. Beautiful. Oh, 5 minutes, great. Is that my wind-up? Okay. And we will be asking people, when you ask a question, that maybe you can make it available to everybody, but if you urgently feel you've got to ask one particular person, that's fine as well. We want to thank the candidates for attending. We want to thank Waverley College for, I think it's at their theatre, and And I guess in the spirit of the exercise today, you know, we're asking all voters to go beyond this place to get this more fully on the agenda, not just in Wentworth, but right across the country. And in Wentworth, the refugees have set themselves a rather ambitious agenda. They've been holding events across the electorate for the past week, and they've set themselves the ambitious goal of having another 20 in this coming week. Wouldn't it be great if we could do that right across the country? Yeah. So I want to thank them very, very much for the work that they've done. There will be the possibility of staying behind for some time to talk to the candidates after the forum is officially closed around 6 o'clock. Now, have I forgotten to say anything? I'll take the silence as consent. Very good. And now we're going to move on to hear from our candidates. In order, the first person who's going to speak is Dr. Kerryn Phelps, independent candidate. Kerryn, over to you.
Is this working? Thank you very much, and thank you all for the invitation to speak to you here tonight about this incredibly important issue for Australia and our future, and the view of Australia that is presented to the world. I'm ashamed of the policy of offshore detention and the treatment of asylum seekers on Manus Island and Nauru. As a doctor and as a human, it offends me. It offends me because I understand the issues that have been faced by these people, because I'm a medical professional and because I'm a human being. Now, I'm going to tell you a story about Jackie, my wife, her parents. When they were 8 years old, one of them was in Austria, her father was in Austria, and he barely escaped from Austria before he was to be sent to a certain fate. He was put on a kinder transport with a number around his neck and put on a train as an 8-year-old child without a parent and shipped over to London, then put onto a boat and came to Australia, where he sought safety, escaping the Holocaust in Europe. Jackie's mum, Jutta, used to still cry when she talked about when she was 8 years old and she was sitting in school and she was asked that all the children who were Jewish were asked to stand up. And when they stood up in the classroom, they were told to leave and never come back, that they weren't welcome to have education anymore. And she managed to escape. But she never overcame the grief of losing every one of her family members. So Australia has a long history which has been built on the hard work and built on the dreams of refugees and asylum seekers and migrants here to Australia in all sorts of circumstances. I recently met a family from Iran who escaped because of religious persecution in Iran. I have patients from refugee backgrounds who tell me their stories of fear and of courage. I hear, as an Australian, the stories of people who are incarcerated on Manus Island and Nauru, innocent people, escaping persecution and trauma in their own countries. Women who are being sexually violated. Children suffering from traumatic withdrawal syndrome, having to be drip-fed to keep them alive because they've given up all hope. This breaks my heart, and it breaks the heart of many Australians. We are a good-hearted people being led by a heartless government. And the thing that disturbs me even more is that this is now a bipartisan approach. This is now policy of the Liberal and Labor governments to maintain this cruel offshore processing regime. And we must find a solution. Now, I'm no newcomer to this issue. When I was the president of the Australian Medical Association back in 2000 to 2003, I visited Philip Ruddock when he was the relevant minister, and I pleaded for children to be removed from detention for health reasons, for reasons of education, and for reasons of humanity. The government at the time refused. Eventually, I put together a coalition of health and psychological groups, paediatricians, psychiatrists, psychologists, and the AMA, and we demanded the release of children from detention, and eventually it did happen. And then we saw this particular policy come in. Now, I'm very proud of my colleagues in the AMA, the thousands of doctors who've signed the hashtag Kids Off Nauru policy proposal, the demand by medical colleagues, medical colleges, organisations to remove children immediately, evacuate them on medical grounds from Nauru because of our deep, deep concern about their well-being, about their health and about their emotional state. To remove those children immediately and their families to Australia for urgent medical treatment. That request has been ignored. Not only has it been ignored, but the government has spent $320,000 fighting not to have these children evacuated for medical treatment to Australia. Médecins Sans Frontières in the last few days has been expelled from Nauru. For those of you, how many people have seen the video of the doctors who were working on Nauru? Now, as a colleague of theirs, I could feel the compassion, I could feel the sense of outrage that they had, that not only could they not continue to do the work that they were doing there, but they were not going to be allowed to go back. And yet they were telling us, very bravely, the story of what was going on Nauru and how they felt about it. The crossbenchers are the only one in this parliament who are talking about any other solution. And we need to be looking for solutions. I've talked about evacuating children and their families immediately from Nauru, but that can't be the end of it. We have to find a way forward to close Manus Island and Nauru as soon as possible. We must find a solution for these people that gives them full citizenship rights in a country like New Zealand or the United States so that they can start to live full lives. We need to open a dialogue about what can be done to reunite some of these people with their Australian families. We need faster processing, we need the kids and families off Nauru, and we need to fast track a regional third country settlement with a pathway to full citizenship and full rights. Australia, we are not fulfilling our international obligations. We are not fulfilling our humanitarian obligations. We are not fulfilling our obligations as human beings. And as a doctor, I cannot and will not and have not ever stood back and been silent and said nothing about this. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Kerryn, and we'll have opportunities to question each of the candidates, including Kerryn at the end. Our second speaker then today is, I'd like to invite to come up and say his piece, is Dominic WY Kanak for the Greens.
Is that on? Yeah. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for coming along to hear what the candidates have to say as part of the Wentworth by-election on this very important issue of refugees. And also thank you to the Refugee Council of Australia, and Wentworth for Refugees, and all the other organisations that have put this event together as part of the by-election lead up to our final voting day on October 20th. Like Garfield, I pay my respects to elders and to country. Ladies and gentlemen, the High Commissioner for Refugees from the United Nations and the organisations that Dr. Phelps have already mentioned, the AMA, Médecins Sans Frontières, have called for the immediate closure of the offshore detention centres. We believe under Australian government policy, crimes against humanity, human rights violations are being committed against men, women and children in these centres. Refugees and people seeking asylum have every right to come to Australia and ask for our support and protection. We must act on the advice of these eminent bodies. The Greens have been a consistent voice for refugee rights inside and outside Parliament for decades. Australia needs a refugee policy that matches the values of humanity, fairness and compassion. Our current intake of refugees remains completely inadequate. The Greens are committed to increase our humanitarian intake to 50,000 people per year. The Greens are the only party in the federal parliament that has voted to end offshore detention on Manus and Nauru, and to bring those currently detained there to Australia or another country. Over 90 innocent children are detained on Nauru today. At least 50 of these children have life-threatening symptoms of traumatic withdrawal syndrome, where children stop eating and drinking and lie comatose in bed. And of course, a failure to act will almost certainly result in the deaths of these children. We must end temporary protection visas, replace them with permanent protection visas. That must happen if Australia is to meet its human rights obligations, so we can provide the support people are entitled to when they come to this country. The Greens are aiming to increase the Status Resolution Support Services, the SRSS. And the federal parliamentary colleagues of the Greens are getting the Parliamentary Budget Office to cost this, and it will make an announcement shortly. For many years now, successive coalition and Labor governments have failed to act in accord with our obligations under international refugee treaties. Anyone has a right to come to Australia by plane or boat and ask for protection, and our government should process them on the Australian mainland. We should not outsource our responsibilities to neighbouring countries. Offshore processing centres at Manus and Nauru should be closed, and the men, women and children immediately brought to Australia. The mental health crisis and the levels of self-harm that the people imprisoned on these islands are suffering amount to crimes against humanity, human rights violations. These are not just my words. Human rights lawyers speaking out have said similar and the same things. Barrister and human rights lawyer Julian Burnside has spoken of the crimes he believes current and former politicians are guilty of in this respect. Also, a group of international lawyers have lodged a submission with the International Criminal Court that argues that the bodies responsible for the Australian-run overseas detention camps could be charged with crimes against humanity. The so-called refugee deal with the US should be scrapped. We must show common decency and humanity and bring people detained on Manus Island and Nauru to Australia. This arrangement is causing more anguish and distress for the people imprisoned in those places. Just think about it. When the history of this time is written, Australia's actions will be judged as a shocking example of human abuse and an abrogation of our nation's international responsibilities. Prime Minister Scott Morrison and Minister Peter Dutton are directly responsible for the current situation on Nauru and must be held accountable for their cruelty. So the Greens stand for refugee rights, and we are proud that this is one of the main platforms of our current by-election campaign. You can make your views on refugees count, make your views on refugee policy known, and you can vote one Greens in this by-election and send a message to the federal government. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dominic. I'd like to thank both of our first two speakers for sticking to the time, making my job very easy. But our third speaker then is Andrea Leong from the Science Party. Thank you, Andrea.
Thank you. Thank you to the organisers, and thank you all for coming today. There are 16 candidates in the by-election, and I encourage you to check out all of their views and policies on refugees and asylum seekers, because a vote for proper treatment of these people who are seeking asylum will send a message to Canberra. Now, I went to my first refugee rally in 2003. It was a couple of years after the Children Overboard affair, where the Howard government told people that asylum seekers threw children overboard as part of their attempt to gain entry into Australia. That shameful lie has tainted Australian refugee policy and perhaps our entire relationship to democracy ever since. The demonisation of people seeking safety has continued, and unbelievably it has also escalated since. There's nothing like uniting the people, or trying to unite the people, against a minority group perceived as threatening, especially if that minority group can't vote, but it will not work. For that rally in 2003, I painted a sign that read "Boundless Plains to Share." 11 years later, in 2014, I recreated that sign on a placard and took it down to Cronulla to protest outside Scott Morrison's office. The pace of political change can be excruciatingly slow, and so I thank you all for turning out today and putting your energy into this issue. As Immigration Minister at the time, Scott Morrison had implemented Operation Sovereign Borders, the policy of turning back the boats. We need to remember and remind everyone else that ScoMo, our daggy dad Prime Minister, is the architect of untold misery. And I really do mean untold, because journalists are often denied entry to Nauru to report on the conditions there in Australia's offshore detention centres. Our government for years told us that this was a matter for the Nauruan government only. But we've recently learned that the Australian government has also had a hand in those visa denials to keep these conditions out of the minds of the Australian public. So we're being encouraged to wash our hands of this issue and make it not our problem. And in fact, as we know, Australia is a signatory to the United Nations Refugee Convention, but we have abandoned our responsibilities, as you well know. The Science Party and I will engage with this problem of displaced people and forced migration. The first step is not to view human beings as a problem, but to view them as people who have a problem. In this case, they have been forced to migrate. Short-term actions are likely to be local and regional. We must, of course, accept New Zealand's offer to resettle refugees and make sure the US deal goes ahead. The Science Party would triple refugee intake from 6,000 to 18,000 people per year, and Australia has done this before. There's precedent for this. In the 1980s, when at the time Australia's population was only 15 million as opposed to 25 million today. So 18,000 refugees is fewer on a per capita basis now than it was then. So this is something that we can absolutely do. We want strong migration generally, and we actually want to build the housing and infrastructure needed to accommodate increased migration. That includes building a charter city in regional Australia, not to force or coerce any migrants to move out, because once people come here, they are Australians. We want to make it attractive for Australians to move to regions outside the major cities. Now, the Australian Bureau of Statistics using moderate assumptions, has estimated that Australia's population will reach 54 million by the end of the century, and the Science Party is planning for that likely reality. Anyway, in the longer term, apart from the fact that the boats have not stopped, we don't solve the refugee problem by stopping the boats. We could start by listening to experts in the field and people with lived experience of being refugees and asylum seekers. And in the past, we have assembled an expert panel on asylum seekers. We just ignore their recommendations, and our government does what it was going to do anyway, and implemented the current Pacific solution. So while I obviously appreciate the idea that we should be compassionate, we absolutely should, it's not about us having compassion for some group that we define as them. It's about us being decent as Australians and not degrading our own humanity by treating people inhumanely. Let's also get rid of the narrative of the grateful refugee. Once Australia ratified the Refugee Convention, it became our obligation to implement minimum standards in the way we treat refugees and asylum seekers. If we were to treat refugees properly, we wouldn't be doing anyone a favour that they should be grateful for. We'd simply be following the law. And speaking of following the law, as I'm sure we all know here today, seeking asylum is legal. So Australia's treatment of refugees is a major factor that's motivating me to run as a candidate in Wentworth, and I'm committed to engaging in sincere discussions to find solutions to the problem. So the first step that we need to take is to close the camps and bring them here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andrea. And our final candidate speaking this afternoon is Licia Heath, Independent. Thank you, Licia.
Thank you, everybody, for coming today, and to the different alliances that have put on an event like this. When you have the nation focused on a by-election like this, then this is the absolute platform to elevate an issue. So thank you for doing it, and I think you will find that there's an alliance of views up on this stage. I do not believe and will not accept that our choice on this issue is between people dying at sea and permanent offshore detention. I take utter disdain when our politicians try to use either of those narratives with us and say that we are naive if we think offshore detention is not the only way, that if we're for onshore detention and processing of asylum seekers, then we must also be pro people dying at sea. I find it utterly offensive, that narrative. And should I be elected as the federal member for Wentworth, I will continue my fight to shut down Manus and Nauru. If I am not elected, I will continue the same fight. So you've seen an alliance of views really on this stage, and in 2001 is when Australia put into place its Pacific Plan. Just in case that wasn't clear. The Pacific Plan was about overseas processing of asylum seekers, so whether it be Christmas Island or PNG or Nauru. But if you were found to be a genuine asylum seeker, you were then transferred to Australia. So what changed in 2013? Well, in 2013 started Pacific Plan 2, which was the same as Pacific Plan 1. However, there are a couple of key differences. The differences are extensive and are part of the critical problem that we find ourselves in now. Firstly, if you are found to be a genuine asylum seeker, you will remain where you are. You will not come to Australia. Secondly, the purview of the security and the management of those sites is no longer under Australian law. It is moved to an arrangement with Manus and Nauru, and it is under their purview and management and oversight. And then the third piece to that is the media blackout. Now, the combination of those factors is an utter red flag up a pole for anyone in this country that we export our responsibility to people and we can't see what they're doing. It is just utterly unacceptable. And they feed in exactly to the federal policies that I'm standing on and what separates me from the other candidates in this race. That the mix between the external and voices and vested interests in our current political decision-making process must be removed. So on the media front, at the Pacific Forum in September, you had the ABC and the Guardian not allowed into Nauru. You had the president of Nauru weigh into the situation and attack our media. And you had journalists arrested that did try to get there. Is this acceptable to us? It is, and to think that it's acceptable to our politicians astounds me. To think that private parties are actually profiteering from this is unacceptable to me as well. But that's what's currently happening. The other part of the media scope that's happening currently, and I've spoken with people at the Refugee Council about this, is when they try to raise this issue with our media in Australia, it gets a very distorted view. Or it can't get into the ether of the media either. So when you try to present to a News Corp publication, does anyone want to have a guess how much of the media News Corp owns in Australia? 70%. Oh, thank you. Then we can't even raise this issue on an onshore platform. So let me wind up with this. You have an absolute elevated right and responsibility in 6 days' time to make sure that you vote on this issue to ensure that you send an absolute message to the Liberal Party, not preferences, on this issue. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Licia. And that, after those very disciplined, staying to time presentations from our candidates, would you please thank them, please? Okay, as I said at the start, we're going to just focus for a short time on two particular issues that have been identified by Wentworth refugees of concern. The first of those is around the whole issue of the Status Resolution Support Service, which is under very serious threat, and Ruth Cohen is here to put a question, a brief explainer, and ask the candidates about their commitment to act on it. Ruth, whereabouts are you? There she is. And here comes the microphone rapidly. Okay, thanks, Ruth.
Thank you so much. Okay. Thank you so much, and thank you to all the panel for coming and showing your concern. Most of the discussion this afternoon has been about Manus and Nauru, incredibly important, but I want to redirect our attention to what's actually happening in Australia. I want to ask you about your approach to the recent cuts to life-saving support for people seeking asylum in the Australian community. Since late last year, the Australian government has been systematically cutting off the meagre but life-sustaining income support, torture and trauma counselling services, and emergency support for children, women and men seeking asylum. Students learning English and all those who were going full-time to TAFE to gain skills for employment now get no support. And since August this year, anyone deemed work-ready, in inverted commas, via an internal and non-reviewable Department of Home Affairs assessment are cut off any support. The numbers are stark. 800 people are already cut off. A further 6,500 are to be assessed in coming months. And there's likely to be more than 3,000 people in wealthy Sydney with no support. Organisations based in this electorate, such as the Jesuit Refugee Service, St Francis Social Service and Lou's Place, are absolutely stretched to the limit, already supporting significant increases in demand for emergency food parcels, beds and shelters for the homeless, and money for essential medicines. It looks as though we are manufacturing a humanitarian crisis in our own streets. So I asked the panel, how will you tackle this horrible policy of cutting support if you are elected?
Ask each of our candidates to respond, and we might reverse the order that we saw the presentations in. So, Licia, I'll ask if you could respond first. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for the question. It's a critical element that you've raised. I would be advocating to reinstate the support, of course. Firstly, not just for making sure that these asylum seekers are welcomed into our community, but they are supported to enter and contribute to the community, which is absolutely what they want to do. So I don't know if you want a longer answer than that. I would be advocating to reinstate the support.
Okay, thanks, Licia. Andrea.
Yes, to echo that, just reinstate the payments. It's that simple. We could afford it before, we can afford it now. Our not-for-profits do a great job, but this is the job of the government, and this is what we pay our taxes for. I don't think the lack of transparency with the Office of Home Affairs does not bode well. That's part of, I think, a deeper problem with some of our government departments where we can't get information, even through freedom of information requests. So that's another problem that's systemic. What was the final point about that? It escaped me.
It'll come to you.
Yep.
Okay, Dominic.
I already covered in my initial address that the Greens are actually aiming to increase the status resolution support services. Thank you. And we're going as far as taking that extra step to get the Parliamentary Budget Office to cost that so that we can provide the figures more directly. And as part of the by-election campaign, as it's already raised within policy and raised again as a significant issue by Ms. Khan's question, and as this forum is directly on this issue, we can seek for them to perhaps move those calculations on a little quicker and maybe try and get some figures actually this week, or otherwise we maintain a commitment to keep chasing those figures and ask the Parliamentary Budget Office with its resources to cost what increasing the state status resolution support services will be. With local government also, we deal with homelessness as a broader issue. So through the local government sphere, and obviously some of you know the other part of my background is the Deputy Mayor to this local council, the Waverley Council. I think we will need to reassess our policy and our approach from a local government level to what is referred to as the manufacture of a human crisis, a humanity crisis, if this goes ahead. So the current government just needs to reverse that policy and maybe take a step similar to the Greens and increase those support services. They also need, as the federal government leaders in this country, to be aware that this crisis will filter down through state to local government and to local councils. And if there is some amendments needed and some strategy to be in place, then local government must be included in that, because they are the first ones to deal with the homelessness issue. Thank you.
Thank you, Dominic.
The Australian government spends billions of dollars a year in maintaining offshore processing on Manus Island and Nauru. The Australian government has spent already $320,000 trying to stop children from getting the medical care that they need here in Australia. So that this is not about affordability. This is not about budgets and meeting bottom lines. This is a signal of hostility to refugees seeking assistance here in Australia. It's not about money. Now, we are facing a very stark choice next Saturday, in 6 days' time, of an independent with a very real possibility of being able to send a message to the Liberal government that they must move away from these heartless policies and have somebody sitting on the crossbench who might actually be able to continue to speak up about these issues as I have done for the last 20 years, who is able to bring a compassionate and humanitarian approach to these issues. Back in the early 2000s, I called for better welfare, better healthcare, educational opportunities, employment opportunities for people awaiting processing onshore here in Australia, and for removing children from detention. If I am elected, and we know it's a long shot, but if I am elected next Saturday, I will make sure that I continue to speak up about these issues to re-establish a proper living allowance for people who are awaiting processing, who are living in our community, and all they want is the opportunity to contribute to Australia in the same way as generations of migrants, refugees and asylum seekers have done when they become residents and citizens of this great country.
Thank you, Kerryn. Thank you to all four. The second, we should all remember that this issue we're talking about at the moment is about 7,500 people at least been rendered hungry and homeless, and most of those are in the suburbs of Sydney and Melbourne. So I think your vote next weekend, it always counts, but particularly counts now when we're just a few months away from a federal election. The second issue we were going to have a consideration of now is on the commitments from candidates to getting kids off Nauru. And to put that to the forum, I'll call upon Philip Feinstein.
Thank you, Phil, and thank you everybody for your comments. So my name is Philip Feinstein. I'm from Jews for Refugees. Children and their families have been trapped on Nauru for 5 years. 5 years of cruelty, inhumane conditions, and little hope of a solution that has led to a massive health crisis. Young children are attempting suicide, suffering traumatic withdrawal syndrome. The Australian Medical Association is calling for urgent attention. So first of all, are you willing to publicly support the call to get kids off Nauru? And secondly, if elected, will you commit to do all that you can to ensure the evacuation of children and their families to Australia by Universal Children's Day, the 20th of November, offering either resettlement in Australia or another suitable country that welcomes them? Thank you.
Okay, so throwing it open to our candidates, who would like to respond first? We might go this way. Okay, Andrea, thank you.
Yep. Oh, and I should just mention, that was, Kerryn, you mentioned the other point that escaped me at the time, the black hole that is for public funds that is offshore detention. As for kids on Nauru, yep, absolutely, get the kids off Nauru, get everyone off Nauru. A few weeks ago I went to an event organised by Refugee Action Coalition Sydney that brought a former nurse from Nauru and a lawyer who's working pro bono to get the children off, and they have to get these children off Nauru one by one through a court case each time for each child that needs medical attention urgently. So it has to get to that point. There's only so many lawyers who can be there working on those cases, and so they have to do triage, basically, who is in the most urgent need of care. So it has to get really dire, and it's shocking the level of just the need for urgent healthcare that we see, and the levels to which our government will go to try and stop these people from receiving healthcare, actually taking these cases to court. And absolutely, as soon as possible, resettle these people. Reverse Operation Sovereign Borders. There's no reason why these people should not be resettled in Australia. There's also, as I mentioned, the New Zealand offer, by November 20th or sooner, as soon as possible.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Licia.
Thank you for the question. Yes, I will absolutely advocate to get kids off Nauru, and have been already with some of the work that I've been doing publicly and behind the scenes as well. So the power of an independent coming into this seat can't be underestimated. So the ability, as Kerryn said, to work with the crossbench and to find supporters within the major parties as well to corral so that you can get a bill tabled and up and over the line is the critical role of somebody in a non-partisan position. I know this is something that is closer to home, but I have demonstrated that I can do that in the seat of Wentworth. So I have worked with the Liberal Party, the Labor Party and the Greens to advocate for a new public high school in this area, and I've advocated to have it on all of the main platforms of all of the candidates running in this by-election. I haven't done it by table thumping or being adversarial with any of the parties. I've done it by prosecuting a case and by being respectful and civil and unrelenting. And that is absolutely the role that an independent must play. They cannot polarise anyone, they must bring everyone around. And on that same issue, yesterday I wrote to all the candidates asking for their help to elevate and relieve the issue of homelessness, not just in Wentworth, but in the state and across the country. Because we have the opportunity to raise issues that the major parties are not currently. And that is beholden on us. And again, whether we succeed in this election or not, the proof statement is, does that work continue after this? And for me, it definitely will.
I think it's important that we don't think, and that the community generally doesn't think, of children of refugees and of asylum seekers as other. When I look at the faces of these children, and I'm a mother and I'm a grandmother, and when I see the faces of these children, I see the faces of my own children, my grandchild, the children of my patients, the children that I know. They mustn't be nameless, and they're certainly not faceless. And I think that the important thing is that we treat these children and their families as the way we would treat our own children and our own families. And I'm proud of my profession. The AMA led this charge by calling for children to be evacuated immediately from Nauru for essential medical treatment. And it's not waiting for a major disaster, a life-threatening condition. Many of these children are already facing life-threatening conditions, but they are also facing the very real prospect of lasting, possibly permanent psychological and emotional damage. And that should not rest easily on the conscience of any Australian. So what I believe is that we should heed the call of the Australian medical profession and Médecins Sans Frontières, evacuate the children and their families immediately to Australia, regardless of any other third country settlement option or whatever happens in any kind of negotiated solution, hopefully in the near future. But the urgent situation is that these children have one life to live only, and they are living it in horrendous circumstances, and it must not continue in our name.
Ladies and gentlemen, in this sort of situation, it could be the possibility of organising a pledge letter through the Refugee Council of Australia and other NGOs, as has been mentioned on some of the information we've seen this afternoon. It's common in the process of elections for candidates to commit and sign to such pledges, and if those candidates who want to commit towards bringing those kids away from Nauru and bring them here to proper medical treatment as Philip has raised and has raised on behalf of the Refugee Council of Australia, then I'm sure that every candidate should be able to commit to and to sign such a pledge. So if that was something that the Refugee Council of Australia wanted to get together as a result of this forum this afternoon, even those candidates who are not up here on stage and those candidates who haven't even agreed to attend could sign such a pledge. And then I think it would be a very real result of the vote for this by-election on the 30th of October to have those kids off Nauru by Universal Children's Day a matter of 30 days later, and it would empower this community to go on and do more work for refugees.
Okay, thank you, Dominic. Folks, we've now come to hear from you, from Q&A from the floor, and I've been reminded to remind you of the rules of the discussion, which is basically one question per person, and we'd like you to make sure that it's a question to the candidates, and that your question should not take more than about a minute to ask, and I'll be jumping on that if it does, okay? And we've got lots of hands going up, so microphones, if they're ready? Okay, we might start down the front here with, thank you. You could give us your name and any other identifier you'd like to reveal.
Bobby Waterman, and I'm with a group called Supporting Asylum Seekers Sydney. We visit Villawood Detention Centre each week for the last 6 years. And my question to the panel is, what are your views on indefinite onshore detention?
Okay, then at this stage, any candidate can buy in to answer or not. It's up to you. So we'd like to respond to Bobby. Okay, Licia.
Indefinite detention is prison. I can't see it described as anything else. So I am against indefinite detention, offshore or onshore.
The difference, of course, is if you go to prison, you know when you're going to get out. Yeah.
No, exactly. Sorry. Indefinite detention. It's not only inhumane. It doesn't make any sense when you've committed no crime. If we can have community detention, we have that. While claims are being assessed for people, then that seems like a much better option. And also the length of time that we seem to take to assess these claims. I've never been able to understand why we have people in detention for years while we assess their refugee claims when other countries seem to do it much quicker. So that's something I think Australia also needs to commit to.
Apart from the psychological damage that is done to people who are in indefinite detention, and that includes the loss of hope, which is a life-threatening condition, we are missing out on an extraordinary skill set of people who could be contributing to the Australian community. So it doesn't make any sense for the sake of the people who are detained, and it doesn't make any sense for the Australian community who could be benefiting from the skills of the people who are locked up in detention not being as useful as they could be to the Australian community as residents while their claims are being processed. So it doesn't make sense on any level.
Yeah, definitely indefinite detention is still a violation of those people's human rights and against the conventions that Australia has signed to. And we should be looking at quicker processing in a form of community visa that allows those people, once the initial security checks are done, allow them to start merging into our community and merging with those people who will give them a safer environment. Detention is not safe. Indefinite detention is a crime.
Okay, we want to go up the back there, please, lady in the red and white blouse. Yeah, my eyesight's not too bad.
Thank you. I'm just going to pass it to my husband.
That's why you're wearing the red and white, huh? And he's wearing the grey, yeah.
I'm very great. My name is Tony Coburn, and I'm a Wentworth voter now, but recently I was the chair of a Victorian-based human rights group, which is the background of my interest in this issue. My question is actually directed to Dr. Phelps. I mean, there was a period when you were leading the Australian Medical Association, and at that time it was possible to persuade even Phil Ruddock and John Howard that incarcerating children was a bad idea on medical grounds. What were the arguments that worked then? Could they work now?
The arguments that were around health and well-being of the children in particular, and the fact that it just could not be justified on that basis. And there was a real strength in a coalition of people who were interested and passionate about child welfare. And that was psychologists, psychiatrists, paediatricians, GPs, people from a range of different healthcare professions expressing those concerns. And we are seeing now the same kind of movement from the medical profession and from associated health professions related to the health and well-being of the people who are being detained at the moment, the children and their families on Nauru. And the call is coming from a place of caring, a place of compassion, and I believe that this is what we need to motivate the Australian community generally, because this is not just about talking to politicians who are interested in whether they get voted in at the next election. This is about speaking to the Australian people and encouraging the Australian people to speak to their representatives in Parliament and have them drive this agenda, and with the medical profession as the group that is actually lighting that flame that hopefully the Australian people will take forward.
In the back there, Annalena, we need a microphone here. Thanks. If you just stand up and wave your hand, we'll get one. Here comes the mighty Shakufa. Thank you. Your question.
Hi, my name's Amelina and I'm a former government officer for the Immigration Department. I know how difficult it is to negotiate with other countries and try and get them to take refugees. It's really commendable to hear the fantastic statements from all of the candidates. I note there's been a couple of references to finding international solutions, say in the US or New Zealand. Now, the reason we have a lot of people still on Nauru is because the New Zealand offer hasn't been taken up, and two, the US has been picky about who it wants to take. Are you committed to actually bringing people onshore, and will it be more than just the children? Bringing children onshore without their family is detrimental to the kids. We would have another situation like the stolen generation. If we commit to seeking international solutions, we are committing to an ongoing situation like the one we have now. Can you respond? Have I misunderstood you?
Okay, well, who'd like to go first? Dominic? Yeah, correct first.
The Greens have a strong policy to end detention in Manus Nauru, to bring those people here and to process them here. Also the commitment to have quicker processing times, to explore the operation of community visas that have those people in that type of situation for as less time as possible. So that's already basic Greens policy, is to end offshore detention, bring those people here and give them safer pathways to become part of our community. And it's also a point about the importance of this by-election and the impact it will have on whether or not the government will still have the numbers to progress the policies that it does have. So this community has a rare opportunity through this by-election to send that message to the federal government, and the candidates in this by-election should be listening to the views in this forum and to the views of groups in our community who are already saying those similar things. Groups like the Grandmothers Against the Detention of Refugee Children, Teachers for Refugees, groups associated with Amnesty International. I mean, all you have to do is listen to your community and listen to forums like this, and the decisions become easy. If you're going to be obstinate and progress and remain with policies that are probably closer to the era of close cousins to that thing on the wall, I think that's a two-headed dragon, but I think probably its close cousin is a dinosaur. So if you want to keep your policies about these human rights issues in the dinosaur age and make no change, you should be out of government, and there should be a strong message to you from this community that you don't deserve to be in government.
Yeah, the Science Party has a long-standing policy of closing the offshore detention centres. Apart from being inhumane and expensive, we don't know what's going on there because of the lack of transparency. So we would close the offshore detention centres, kids off Nauru, everyone off Nauru, and I'll be at a protest on the 27th of October in the city to push for that. I've done it again. Yeah.
It'll come back to you, it's all right.
Yeah, close the offshore detention centres, absolutely, and bring these people to Australia. There's no reason, that's it. Operation Sovereign Borders should never have been implemented. There's no reason to treat people differently because of the way they arrive to Australia to seek asylum.
Operation Sovereign Borders, I often think, sounds like something Bruce Willis should star in rather than be a policy of government. Anyone else like to have a crack at that? We'll take our next question. Okay.
I'll just make one question. Unequivocally, children should not be removed from their parents. So if children come off, if it's kids off Nauru, it's kids and their families off Nauru.
All right, we'll go to the middle. So in the middle there, please.
Hello, I'm Stephen. I help organise the weekly protest at the Queen Victoria statue for refugees. Thank you. Couple of things. I do recall my father, when he got to New Zealand in 1940, he was from a country that New Zealand was then at war with, the Third Reich, and he was free from day one. There's only one thing he couldn't do: he couldn't join the Air Force. In the end, he joined the Air Force. But this, we're almost taking for granted, yet we have to lock people up for a little while for some reason. There's actually no reason for locking people up when they claim asylum. That's a fiction. That's a fiction that they put in 1993 under Labour, under Keating. That's been we've all grown up with it. We think it's like normal and part of the furniture. I completely reject it, and I think many people do. Can I ask, what about a Human Rights Act? An Australian Human Rights Act.
Okay,
Thirdly, sorry, and I just ask what they think the role of the ABC has been, because I remember there was direct appeals from the children on Nauru about 1.5 years ago. The ABC refused to show the footage of the direct appeals from the kids on Nauru to Turnbull to stop their torment. They underreport the initial violations. They don't report the public protests, and they don't report the human rights reports from Amnesty.
Okay, so two. It's the Human Rights Act and the role of the ABC, yeah?
Yep.
Okay, who'd like to respond? I'm conscious that Kerryn's got to get away probably after this question. Who wants to go first? Todd?
Can I start with the question and go backwards, probably?
You're the candidate. Yep.
So obviously the importance of having a properly funded, independent public broadcaster that does investigative journalism and properly reports these sorts of issues is what we would expect of a fair federal government. And if that's not happening, then that's obviously restricting the voice from the voiceless of those people who need attention focused on their situation. And on the human rights issue, just going back to, I think, the previous question, there's a broad human rights issue. It does pertain to getting those kids here as quickly as possible, but it does go wider, and it looks at potentially a similar situation to what I think the Speaker raised with reference to the Aboriginal stolen generations. So there are broad human rights issues in that respect. There are the human rights issues of breaking the conventions that Australia is signatory to, and obviously all those things need the proper focus of a properly funded and a fair public broadcaster like the ABC.
You raised two important questions there. I have written in the past opinion pieces about the need for Australia to have a Bill of Rights. I think it's a glaring deficiency that we don't have a Bill of Rights, and we should have one. It will take time to develop, but that's no excuse. We must have it. And the second thing is, I've been very outspoken during this campaign about the need for the ABC to be properly funded and independent so it can do its job as our public broadcaster without political or commercial interference, and that's an imperative for the future.
Thank you for the question. I've spoken with people from the New South Wales Council for Civil Liberties regarding a Bill of Rights. It's something that needs to happen, and an approach that they suggest is to bring it in on a state-by-state basis, and then we say, oh look, all the states have a Bill of Rights, let's have a federal one. So whatever way we get it, that would be something we need to see. And of course, the ABC, I've made my views known to ABC friends on this issue, that I wouldn't commit a dollar amount particularly to the ABC. I think what it needs more is independence in the form of funding. So the model of funding for the ABC needs to be a little bit, needs to be reviewed and made more independent so that the government of the day can't decide how exactly to fund the ABC from year to year, or I think it's a 3-yearly agreement. The independence of the public broadcaster is so paramount to having an informed public that can make decisions on these issues.
Thank you. Look, I think you'll find us all in agreement. The Bill of Rights I agree with as well. I am concerned that we are already signed up to the 1951 Refugee Convention, and we are contravening that. So, that is the more immediate situation for me. The idea that you could get up a Bill of Rights with the current government is laughable, I believe. Just like if an offer comes from New Zealand to take current, to solve that problem that is ignored by our government, I couldn't understand for a second why that would be ignored. It's ignored because of an ideology that our current government has to refugees and asylum seekers that we must break in the coming opportunities to vote. From the ABC point of view, like I said, it's one of my key policies, the idea that we need media ownership inquiry in this country and reform as well. And absolutely paramount to that is refunding of the ABC and making sure that it is independent from political interference. And when you see people handing out their how to vote card for the ABC, you'll see me at the top of that right now.
Okay, well, Kerryn has to move shortly, as we said at the start. At the end of this session, we're going to give the candidates a couple of minutes for a wrap-up final statement. So we're going to let Kerryn do that now before she goes, and then we'll return to questions.
I'd just like to thank everyone for the opportunity to come here today, and particularly to see how many people are prepared to come out on a Sunday afternoon and to fly the flag for better treatment for refugees. And I think it's particularly important that this is happening in the context of a by-election where there is an uncertain outcome for the government, because it is truly making them focus on issues of a socially progressive nature that perhaps have been swept aside or ignored, or where it's been thought that they could just do whatever they wanted and nobody would notice or care. I can see that in this room there's a lot of people who care, and I thank you for the opportunity to speak to you tonight. Okay, thank you, Kerryn. And we'll, of course, give
all of the other candidates the opportunity to provide their closing comments at the end. Now we're back to questions again. Now we haven't had one from this side down the bottom yet, I don't think, so here we go.
Narita Rossell, I'm a freelance journalist and I've been supporting refugees since 2001. I would like to ask the candidates how important they think it is to address the issue of ethnic difference. And I do believe that many of the problems caused here is for not understanding that people have a different culture, which has been so enriching for this country. And when Malcolm Fraser was in the chair, he sent a team around Australia to talk about when the Vietnamese people were introduced into Australia after the Vietnamese War. Would the candidates consider doing such a thing to address some of the fear and also some of the people like Pauline Hanson and Fraser Anning? Terrorists, in other words.
Yes, the afternoon was going swimmingly until you mentioned Pauline Hanson and Fraser Anning. Okay, who'd like to respond? Licia?
I'll go first. Would I consider putting together a group like that to go around and... So you're saying to explain to the community, to bring the community on the journey for that? I think there's two parts to this answer. The first part is, yes, I would. The step before that is, I think it would be redundant unless we clean up how our politicians are acting currently. So their xenophobic language and their movement to dog whistling when it's politically expedient for them is having a trickle-down effect into how our communities react to this issue. The leadership at that level must change. So it is a two-part question. Yes, I would really like to endorse and promote doing that, travelling around the country. But if we have people over the shoulder, our political leaders, dog whistling while that's happening, I think it contravenes that. So hence focusing at the political level at this stage.
Thank you, Licia. Andrea?
Just as a follow-up to that, I think, yes, I do support that sort of initiative. And as you mentioned, Licia, that all that work could be undone by our current politicians, but we could also, on the flip side, have our politicians do a lot of that work in acceptance of new migrants and refugees if they would just change their tune and talk about people who arrive to Australia as not just as humans who are looking for a better life. And also we support services for new arrivals to help them get oriented.
I think some of this work is currently done in various forms by organisations that exist in our community. I've worked with Rabbi Castell on the group Together for Humanity, where religious leaders and representatives of different what you've called ethnicities in the community go around to schools and just talk about diversity and being able to coexist as a community of diverse multicultural people. The issue comes up every time, every month, when Waverley Council is welcoming into our community 50 to 60 new citizens from places and backgrounds from all over the world. We basically have in front of us at those citizenship ceremonies a United Nations, which is going to merge into our community. So we speak about the very issues you raised in that context as part of our welcome to those new citizens into our community and into the Australian family. I think I saw Rabbi Cummins. Yes, Rabbi. There's been work done at the former Chapel by the Sea with multi-faith work that I believe Robert Cavins has been involved with. So having in our community chapel, an organisation like Chapel by the Sea down at Bondi Beach, when it ran in its former way as a community hub to bring those sorts of multi-faith and multicultural issues together is also important things to support in our community. And it should be the role of the federal government to make sure these sorts of work, organisations doing this work continue to be supported in the community, as is the work of Reconciliation Australia, the Refugee Council and the other organisations here that do all this community work that politicians at the federal level should definitely support and continue to fund.
Okay, hand up the back, sir, the blue shirt. They're coming your way right now. Running up the stairs in a way I wish I could once do.
Thank you very much. My name is Ian Enright and I'm a neophyte participant on this issue, and I'm ashamed of that. And I'm also humbled and grateful to everyone here for the efforts that they continue to make. My question is that when government is so fixated on money, why aren't we making the argument that, accepting all of the arguments that have been put today, why aren't we making the argument that this is an horrific waste of money?
Because we're interested and we've looked up these facts and figures, or we've come to an event like this to hear it. But the bigger narrative going around is that, refugees come here and they take all our welfare and they also take all our jobs simultaneously. So what we hear about is obviously not the full picture, and it's misleading, I think on purpose, to again divide the Australian public, turn people against a scapegoat purely for political reasons, and that's a narrative that's trying to be pushed for political gain. And please don't feel ashamed for the time at which you came to this issue. Thanks for being here.
It's an absolutely great point. It was a point I was trying to make before in terms of it's not just about the humane issue. One of the lessons learned is that when you do what we are doing currently, not only do you give up the oversight of what's happening, and undoubtedly the result of that will be some future PM in Australia making a national apology about it, you also forgo your revenue overseas. Now that I would feel less violated if I thought that what we were doing was supporting Nauru and Manus and the communities there and lifting their people out of poverty. But that is utterly what is not happening. It is lining the pockets of some private enterprise and some bureaucrats at the top. So that in reports like this, we see that some of those bureaucrats at the top own dozens of properties around the globe now. And that's off our money. So it is a good angle to run, and it's something that the government will never talk about, for obvious reasons.
What I'll take away from this question is to, again, put issues through our Greens parliamentarians to the Parliamentary Budget Office to maybe get down to the financials and the economics behind the question you raised. But one of the key policies that the Greens are also putting to the community is the establishment of a federal independent commission against corruption. And if we also have that policy about banning political donations, because this is where the rot starts. If you combine those two things, banning political donations, and you establish the equivalent of a federal ICAC, you can start to unravel some of the business deals and the relationships that Licia has alluded to that are behind why these detention centres are maintained as offshore businesses, basically. And once that's unravelled, surely then the politicians involved have no screen to hide behind, and we can get a fairer immigration, a fairer refugee policy, and we can get politicians who are not in there just for career and ambition, but are actually there to represent their constituents and represent the community.
Okay, if you've got questions at the moment, you'll have to hold them for the 15 minutes of discussion with the candidates afterwards, because we've come at the time for closing remarks from each of the candidates. And in the interests of gender equity, we want to ask Dominic to start first and give the women the last word. So the closing statements, you've got about a minute to 2 minutes. The last message you'd like to send to this audience 6 days before the by-election.
Okay. Ladies and gentlemen, this by-election has come about because of bad behaviour at the federal level. I don't want to kind of repeat some of the things I said at a recent public forum with the Bondi Pavilion community for the candidates, but I'm moved to, because it's true, because it just feels like we've been abandoned on all these issues. When you get your parliamentary colleagues who initially select a Prime Minister and then abandon that Prime Minister on all sorts of different issues, maybe about energy issues, and with a Prime Minister that's just about to take a brave step about environmental care, which in our Indigenous way is talking about caring for country. And the slogan of this campaign for us is about caring for country and caring for the community and caring for the climate and taking that to Canberra. When there are Prime Ministers successively that are just about to take that braver step, suddenly they're taken out of office, and often it's because of the issues that were just recently raised about the connections between the lobbyists and the corporation that have taken control of public policy in this country. And it's no longer government by the people, it's government through politicians who are compromised by corporations. That's not what we can, that's not a situation we want to put up with. And the arrogance to use an electorate, we should be called a community, the community of Wentworth. We should try and move away from that language of electorate, because it allows those political parties who just see an electorate as a stepping stone on the career path for someone who's going to bring them money into the party, is going to make sure they stay in government, and they're not genuine about listening to the people and moving their policies with the voices of the people. We can't allow that to continue. This community is a community, not just an electorate, and it's not a stepping stone in the career and ambition of federal politicians. Send that message on the 20th of October. Send that message if you're going to go to pre-poll. Send it soundly to the government and make them think twice about the future of democracy in this country.
Thank you, Dominic. Now, as we mentioned at the beginning, there is another candidate who's with us today, and we're going to give Barry Kildoulis the opportunity to take a minute and pass on his message to the assembled congregation on behalf of the Arts Party. Thanks, Barry.
Great, thanks very much. I was going to say you escaped my grandstanding because I was going to ask a question, be limited to 1 minute, but I'll try and keep it brief. Basically, I think the Arts Party feels that everybody should be treated humanely all the time. And in terms of the refugee issue, of course we should simply abide by our international obligations. Personally, I'm more of a person who favours encouragement rather than punishment, and I've never understood why, and let's face it, detention is a form of punishment, why we are punishing people who ostensibly have committed no crime. So I don't really have a lot to add on top of what the other candidates have said in favour of treating refugees as people and humanely and supporting them when they get here. I was going to ask a sort of practical question, and I'm disappointed that Dr. Phelps has left, because when she spoke she did seem to support the government's current position about resettling the refugees that we still have in detention offshore somewhere. New Zealand, she mentioned the United States. So I would have liked her to be able to clarify that. And I think the questioner asked that almost directly. However, this is an incredibly urgent issue. These people are being damaged. They have been being damaged for many years. It was a dark day when a humanitarian issue became a political football in this country. And they have been being damaged for many years. In terms of urgency, and I've spoke with Tim, the Labor candidate, and let's face it, Labor is probably the alternative government that we might have in the not too distant future. And he said he would advocate within the party for change. I think if you talk to Senator Wong about that, she did the same thing for gay rights and gay marriage, and it took many, many years to get the party to shift. So I do worry that although Tim seemed like a very decent bloke, that would be fairly ineffective in terms of immediate action. I'd like to ask the candidates still here, in terms of immediate action, would they, for example, and would this be effective, refuse to guarantee supply to the government if a minority government needed to be formed, if one of you three were to be elected, or indeed Dr. Phelps, and would that be an effective way to get this issue addressed immediately?
Okay, just in the interest of fairness, we'll allow Dominic to just have a brief response to that, and very, very brief, before I'll ask the other two candidates if you could work that into your final answer. Thanks, really brief, mate.
Look, yes, of course. If the policies of this current government are maintained after the 20th of October, it will be a disaster. As we said with this particular issue, if they maintain the policies that affect those children especially, they'll die. So yes, definitely. We would have to examine supply and bring this government to account properly.
Thank you, Barry. I'll ask you to work into your closing statement. So thanks, Licia.
Thank you. Closing statements?
Yep.
Right, sorry.
Okay. You can answer that first and then closing statement. Up to you.
All right. So, yes, of course, Barry. Expedience, the urgency with which this needs to happen is not a question by anyone on the stage, I don't think. So, yes, that would have our full support. In terms of supply, I have the fundamental view that the vote of a single electorate should not scuttle the government. That said, so I am not. So should I get up? I will. It is not my intent to scuttle the government. However, should I get up, the levers that the person has with the balance of power in this seat, or the balance of responsibility in this seat, are considerable. So, and one of the immediate things that I would be asking for is to expedite asylum seeker reform. So that is a massive negotiation chip that I would use and lead with should I get elected. Do it now. I think we know what you think on this issue. Now you know what the candidates think on this issue. We know through polling of Wentworth, extensive polling, that the majority of Wentworth voters are for onshore processing and closing of offshore and inhumane treatment of asylum seekers. We are in agreement. So why is it not happening? Who is blocking it from happening? That's the fundamental question. And that is the biggest devil, the biggest trick the devil ever played in the US was making voters over there think that their vote didn't count. Doesn't count. but it does count. Your votes count immensely. And I have run a campaign in Wentworth the last 2.5 years fighting for a new public high school, and I know how progressive this seat is. I've seen thousands of people come behind me on that issue. The demographics in this seat have changed markedly in the last 15 years. People are progressive in this seat. Your neighbours are progressive in this seat. You can change the Liberal stronghold on this seat with your vote. And you must pay absolute attention to not just the Liberal policies on this issue, but to those people that are preferencing the Liberal Party on this issue as well. It is fundamental to the outcome on this election and particularly on this issue. Thank you.
And finally, Andrea, your turn.
Thanks for the question. I think, unfortunately, I'll have to remain uncommitted on that issue of supply because I'm just not familiar enough with that particular mechanism.
Closing comment.
Yeah. Thank you again for being here. I think the path forward in the immediate future is clear. Kids off Nauru, everyone off Nauru, everyone off Manus Island. The government recently closed its detention facilities on Christmas Island, so we know it can be done. And the reason we're not doing it is purely political. It's not a technical problem. There's no complexity involved with this immediate act. We just need to close these camps and bring these people here. In the long term, though, refugees, asylum seekers, displaced people, forced migration is a much bigger issue, and I'm going to link another issue to it that sometimes does come up. So we are going to see more people displaced by climate change than we ever have. Australia is going to have to look to be a leader at some point in the near future as our Pacific Island neighbours start to literally lose their homes. So now is the time for Australia to step up, be a leader, which it's lagged behind for so long on refugee policy, and start to negotiate honestly. Just enter these discussions as though it actually wants to solve the problem and find solutions for these people. So in closing, your vote on Saturday will be powerful, and we will prevail. Thank you.
All right, folks, well, that brings our forum this afternoon to a conclusion. I'd firstly like, would you put your hands together and thank Dr. Kerryn Phelps, Licia Heath, Dominic WY Kanak, Andrea Leong and Barry Kilgullis for their participation this afternoon, and wish them good luck. I'd like to also acknowledge the staff of the Refugee Council of Australia who've worked hard to put this together, particularly Kelly and Sam. I'd like to thank Waverley College for this wonderful tent they've got us in this afternoon. And finally, I'd like to thank you. It is a time in history when we're not all particularly proud of, and particularly when you look at the two empty chairs at either side of the stage here that sort of point to a poetic eloquence of what's wrong. However, and you can get full of despair and despondency when that happens, but I mean, these these 5 people who put their hand up at this time to see a just Australia actually prevail, and that this stuff will be part of history rather than define us. I'm also heartened by the fact that just this morning, Nikki Sava on the Insiders program talked about the humanity of the people on Nauru needing to be treated as human and need to be resettled immediately. Now that means the shift is on. That means that the things that people have discussed this afternoon are beginning to bite. And this election is beautifully timed. Your vote does count. These 5 people who've gathered today, we appreciate your efforts. We wish you well. And here's to a better Australia. Thank you for your attendance.